This is the final unit in the mummy science course. I hope throughout the course you've learned a bit about the scientific method and its application into mummy science, and certainly learned a bit about mummification, mummies of the world, and the methods that we use to try and get peoples from long past to tell us their stories about their lives. It seems fitting then here in this last unit to talk about mummy science as a field, how it's evolved. I'd like to address the challenges, limitations, using the case examples, pitfalls, again using a major case example, and what I suggest are the future directions that we can take mummy science down the road to make it a more, to coalesce into the true science that it can be. First of all, the challenges facing mummy science as a discipline. First of all, there are many subspecialties. Mummy studies are sexy because of the public and media and how they embrace them. So people are drawn to them. They want to work with mummies. Sometimes that's altruistic because they're interested in the past. They're interested in that type of detective work, seeking answers to odd questions. And sometimes they're driven because it's a very popular science. There are many, many, many subspecialties being drawn to the field, and most of them are applicable. But this increased variety brings increased lenses with which to view the past, and that's a good thing. So if they're applicable, or even if they're marginally applicable, they may find a way or manner to contribute to mummy science in the future. But what the increased variety of subspecialty also brings is a complexity of interaction. Each comes with its set of standards and practice protocols and ethics. So that's very, very important to consider when we're looking at all the subspecialties involved in mummy science. And the big question, and one of those that we started out this course with, was looking at the anthropologically based subspecialties and medical based subspecialties and see how they meld. Quite frankly, there should be some common ground. Both are required to answer the questions that the long past civilizations have to offer. Another challenge is that of standards. Currently, standards exist for the collection of anthropological data, how we measure bones, how we determine stature, how we determine age from dentition, the dental assessments, and so on. But standards are yet to be set for many of the subspecialties that exist. But if we can establish standards of practice, it will move mummy science towards reproducible research studies and therefore legitimize many of the subspecialties and their involvement. The standardization of a mummy science approach and mummy science and the analyses and methods will validate mummy science as a scientific discipline as a whole. But these standards need to be established globally, since there are mummies all over the world and there are people researching mummies all over the world. So standards need to be set by practitioners within each subspecialty area, bring them to the table, see how they interact with the other subspecialties. This is one of the main challenges facing mummy science today. Another challenge is control. As the field develops, should there be controls? Who sets the rules? In other words, who can study mummies? Who should be called a mummy scientist? What subspecialty, what training should each subspecialty have to be calling themselves a mummy scientist? How can aggressive approaches to control be handled? We do have people in some of the professional organizations applaud them for trying to take a leadership role, but they're doing it without consultation, and that can rub the wrong way. So a congress of sorts may be a usable model, and the academic versus corporate model regulation needs to be considered. If mummy science is a science, I support and applaud the academic model. That is, bringing legitimate proposals that will answer specific questions to the table, not those that will get media recognition necessarily and bring in money for the university or the individual. That's more of the corporate model. So I support the academic versus the corporate model, realizing both aspects of mummy science are important. That is, academic and the business of mummy science. Another challenge facing the evolving mummy science new researchers. Many new researchers are coming into the mummy science arena as the field mushrooms, and they're going out into the field without the perhaps proper preparation. So it's an important question to know who's teaching the new researchers and what are their ethics. As new researchers come into the field of mummy science, there'll be more competition for what little funding there is available for research studies. And because of the media-worthy aspect of mummy science studies, some of the enthusiasm brought in by the new researchers may in fact alter the context of the mummy location, the mummy site. And that decreases the value of that site, decreases the amount of information we can gather. And also we need to establish entry requirements for fieldwork associated with each subspecialty. Not only that, can people, it's sort of a gatekeeping, and it is a control, but it's one to help bring them up to par, up to speed with mummy science, so that number one, they're not repeating old collection methods, but instead they're thinking about new ways to collect data, building on what already is known. Another important challenge is correcting past studies. It is something that mummy science really needs to do. Early work, the late 1800s, early 1900s, was really based on observational science. They didn't have, although they did do x-rays on mummies, for example, it wasn't widespread. People were making their assessments in the field. And newer methods and technologies allow for re-examination of the facts, and it's an ethical responsibility of the field to correct these past studies. Here's a presentation that was just given at the Paleopathology Association meeting in March. A gentleman named John Verano from Tulane University was given just this April in 2008. The title of his talk was Virgin of the Sun and Syphilis at Machu Picchu, Unlikely on Both Counts. Now think about the title, first of all, virgins, syphilis. Shouldn't go together. So here's the chronology that Dr. Verano reported. In 1911, Hiram Bingham, who rediscovered Machu Picchu, said that the mummies, the remains there, the skeletal remains, were virgins of the sun. In 1916, George Eaton said they were all female. But in 1967, a researcher named Goff said, well, there's syphilitic lesions on these female skeletons. So they're all female and they're virgins and they've got syphilis. Then Richard Berger and his wife Lucy Salazar, Mr. Berger was the director of the Yale Peabody Museum for a number of years in the Hiram Bingham collection. They re-examined the skeletal remains from Machu Picchu that were there at Yale in 2004, and they made the demographic adjustments, meaning that demographics, that they weren't all female, number one. And then John Verano in 2003, looking at that same collection of bones, determined that the lesions were not necessarily syphilitic. So, unlikely on both counts. They weren't virgins. There's no way they could tell they were virgins. They certainly weren't all women, and they didn't necessarily have syphilis. So this is a re-examination using new techniques, new measurements, new way to assess those skeletal remains to determine whether or not the old science, the observational science, had any value. And that's an ethical responsibility of mummy science to correct those past studies. Another challenge is one of advancing technologies. As we look around the world, there are the haves and the have-nots, and there are those who have none. Access to the state-of-the-art technology is very limited, and the state-of-the-art technology is very costly and bulky. It simply can't be moved, it can't be utilized by people in the field. Therefore, the question brought to the table is, if a study is done without this state-of-the-art methodology, is it valid? Well, I'm on the side that yes, it is valid, because there is a lot of data collection that you can do in the field with portable equipment, and you don't need the costly, bulky technology. So, yes, state-of-the-art is important. It's critical to keep moving the science forward, but it shouldn't be imposed as a standard because it's not readily accessible to the world, to those people who are involved actively in mummy science research. Another challenge is a hostile takeover of mummy science. There are elitists, people proposing the medical versus the anthropological constructs and sort of battling it out. Egos get involved, notoriety, funding, promotions, and positions within institutions are all woven around getting your name on something, your notoriety. If someone were able to take over and claim mummy science as their own, then they would be known for eternity in the fields of anthropology, archaeology, and probably medical science as well. So we have to be careful of that in mummy science at this juncture. As it moves forward, all the scientists involved, all the subspecialties represented, should have some say in the future direction of mummy science studies. Another challenge, there seems to be a loss of collegiality in mummy science, and this is true in universities in general. Unwilling to debate, people will put something out in the literature and people will ask them questions and they won't respond. Unwilling to share data. Sort of the old school concept exists in some arenas of a single authored paper. And as you've heard, everything we've talked about includes many subspecialties, many specialists to get the information out of ancient mummified remains. So it's almost impossible for a single author to do all the work. Certainly they could write the paper, but many, many contributors had a hand in that paper's production. There has been evidence of character assassination, pedigree assassination. That means they mock or make fun of who taught you, where you came from, what schools you went to. And there have been breaches of ethics, such as borrowing data. That's happened to my colleague Jerry Conlog and I on several occasions. One such case, the x-rays were drying on a line, a clothesline. A graduate student took pictures of those x-rays and then made a report at an important congress, and never giving credit to the lead researcher of that facility, nor to Conlog for his contributions of the radiographic, not to mention the data that was reported in those films, those x-ray films. There are several examples of borrowing data, and these breaches of ethics are intolerable. So that leads to a loss of collegiality. That makes people not want to share data, as it were. So to summarize the challenges facing mummy sciences, there are many subspecialties. Standards are loose. They're being developed. They're trying to be implemented in a unilateral sense. There's quite a bit of a struggle for control. Many new researchers that kind of increase the complexity, decrease the quality control of the research. Correcting past studies should in fact be an ethical responsibility of mummy sciences. The advancing technologies, yes, they're wonderful, but what's the value? What's the true value of those technologies? We need to avoid hostile takeovers by remaining collegial and fighting that loss of collegiality that is apparent in this science and many others as well. If we can maintain an academic air about mummy science as opposed to a corporate air, then I think we have a better chance of mummy science moving itself forward in an appropriate fashion. Now, there are other limitations of mummy science as a discipline. They fall into two broad categories: technological limitations and organizational limitations. First, technological. The current state-of-the-art technology is too large for contextual studies. They can't go out into the desert. Although this has been tried, trucks have been driven in the desert with large instruments. There tended to be a misapplication of those current technologies in those settings. So not only is the technology limited, but the people who operate that technology have limitations as well. Ancient DNA, it's not quite there yet. The reports that come out tend to be sensationalistic and less science-based. Sometimes some of the tissue that we collect is unable to be rehydrated. Therefore, we can't really learn as much about that mummified tissues as we want to, those mummies that we're studying. And certainly costs. As technology increases, so do the costs of that technology, and so do the costs, therefore, of mummy science studies. Organizational limitations. We have to consider the political climate of the country and of the world. Where can mummy studies be conducted, and where can they be conducted safely? Where will the next cabinet, the presidential election that's coming up in the U.S., where will they focus their money and their funds for grants? Professional organizational interactions needs to be increased. Right now it's a limitation. We have people who belong to the Physical Anthropology Association, people who belong to the Paleopathology Association, people who belong to the parasitology groups, and we need to have more formal interaction between and among the leadership of these groups. And there are overzealous self-proclaimed leaders who leap to the podium at conferences and espouse to be direction finders, or the Christopher Columbuses of the field, and it's egotistical at best. University structures also are beginning to limit, as an organizational structure, beginning to limit mummy sciences. University structures are, and perhaps necessarily, but they're moving towards a corporate model, and that is watching the revenues and the bottom line as opposed to supporting academics. And finally, grant structures as an organizational limitation. How are grants structured? Who can apply for those grants? What qualifications are required? And what volume of grant monies are available? These are all limitations, organizational limitations, to the evolving mummy sciences. Now, the pitfalls, I'm going to use this speaks to both the limitations and the challenges facing the evolving mummy science. And I'm going to use a case study, a recent case study. It comes from a book called The Hobbit Trap by a gentleman named Heinemann. And it's a skeletal set of skeletal remains. It's questionable whether they're fossilized or not, but skeletal remains nonetheless were discovered in 2003 on Flores Island in Indonesia, off of Java, as you can see by the little map there. And this individual skeleton, one skeleton that they found, had a diminutive skull, a few long bones, and wrist bones. There's some tools in the cave. Now, automatically they associate these tools with this diminutive individual, but they weren't necessarily his. There's no direct link. And this, remember, is one individual they found and set of tools. In fact, it's not a complete individual. It's dated to be about 13,000 years before present. That's what BP means. And the claim is that this is a new species. Call it the Flores man. They have also called it the Hobbit because of its size. This is an artist's rendition of the Hobbit in its size. The diminutive size was about 1.06 to 1.35 meters in height. Very tidy, compact little person. And this is the Hobbit skull. This is the information that they used to determine this was a new species. The Hobbit skull versus a normal human skull. And it doesn't look like it's a completely fossilized skull to me. All right, let's look at the Hobbit skull features. First of all, there's a small brain volume, smaller than the modern humans. Maybe that's a different species. Crowded jaw. Well, that could mean a different species, but it could also, we know many people with crowded jaws and teeth that don't fit in the mouth that they were born with. And no chin. Well, that's could be taphonomic change. That is a change based on the condition of the soil and how old this skull may well be. And the frontal lobe slope goes directly backwards. So there's some interesting features of this Hobbit skull, and since they don't match the normal modern human skull, voila, a new species was discovered. A new branch was grown on the tree of Homo sapiens, the Flores man. Now, there is a pathological explanation for these differences, something called microcephaly. Other researchers say it's not a new species, but he suffers from microcephaly. This is a microcephalic skull. As you can see, the frontal lobe slopes. It's a small brain case. We don't have the jaw in this picture, but microcephalics also have crowding of their teeth in their jaw. So could have been an individual with microcephaly. So not necessarily a new species. So the people who suggest it's a new species counter. And here's their counter. They made endocasts of the brain case of the Flores man. It's smaller than average, but intelligent. They made the statement that it's intelligent because that's politically correct. We used to think that the brain case size indicated intelligence. The larger the brain case, the more intelligent they were. So in this case, it was a small brain case. People may assume that it was of low intelligence. But they're quick to say that it's intelligence. They don't know that. They don't know that they did not interact with this individual. They simply associated the hobbit remains with the tools found in the cave. It doesn't necessarily mean that that hobbit used those tools or they came from the same time frame. So this report supports the new species theory. Now these are the little bones of the wrist, the capitate, scaphoid, and trapezoid, and comparing the hobbit to the modern human, the middle column with the right hand column. And I've drawn arrows to those areas that they're looking at, the articular surfaces suggest that in fact this is perhaps a new species. Well, once again, that is an important piece of evidence. It could also be a developmental anomaly. So here's our chronology of the hobbit trap. Hobbit was discovered in 2003, 2004. A new species claim was made. Indicast of the brain activity in 2005 says it's a new species. Microcephalic theory came out in 2006, says it's pathological human and not a new species. Wrist bone analysis came out in 2007. Pendulum swung back. It's a new species. Now in 2008, pregnancy plus environmental factors and iron deficiency can produce dwarf cretinism. And this report came out in 2008. There's one other piece of interesting evidence that suggests it's not a new species. Look at the bottom line on this chart. There's a tooth that may have evidence of modern dentistry. And that hasn't been reported in the literature yet. So that's going to be a very important feature. And you know what? The summary of issues here are important. Is it a hobbit? Is it microcephalic? Is it iron deficiency dwarf cretinism or a hobbit? The cave, materials in the cave were radiocarbon dated to be 13,000 BP, not the hobbit itself. That's a critical piece of information. The associated tools found in the cave, were they in any way related to the hobbit? The thin bones versus robust bones was also a question. So these are the issues defining whether or not this is a new species or not. And there's more to come to this battle. So let's look at some of the motivations behind saying it's a new species. If this is a hobbit, a new species, there's fame, notoriety, and money. There's the other motivation that perhaps is suggesting it's not a new species, maybe based on science, more altruistic. But right now we're dealing with the nature of academia, corporate versus academic. Those who are saying it's a new species, their university will be famous forever. And that brings in money. Alumni give more money to those universities. Tourism. National attention has been drawn to Flores and to Java because of the Flores man, because he's supposedly a new species. People come there on ecotourism all the time, tour the caves. They can't see the bones, but they can tour the caves. And this brings a lot of information. The Java man of years ago was the oldest fossilized human on Earth until they found Lucy in northern Africa, central North Africa. And so there was a lot of attention on Java. It brought a lot of tourism. And now it's gone. But hopefully with the Flores man, the tourism is coming back to Java. So that's their take, and their motivation associated with the hobbit trap. And the media too. The media has a big responsibility in trying to keep up with this volleying series of scientific fact in quotation marks. And the media plays an important role, and let's take a look at the media a little bit more closely as it relates to the hobbit. Okay, here's an example of the impact of distortion, seemingly quite innocent. First of all, the height was initially reported to be between 1.06 and 1.35 meters. The first scientific paper used 1.06 meters. The media dropped the 0.06 and the hobbit became 1 meter. Converting meter to inches, the hobbit is now 3 feet 3 inches. The English papers who don't use the metric system, the 3 inches was dropped, and now the hobbit became 3 feet. Therefore, you convert that back to metric by the media, it's 0.92 meters. 0.92 meters. So in 3 years, the hobbit had shrunk 14 centimeters, or 6 inches, just based upon the way in which the media chose to edit and report the data. So the media has an incredible responsibility. I don't believe that the media are trying to say it's a new species or not. I mean, certainly that sells papers, but there are plenty of things that sell papers. But what I think is the more interesting story is the scientific tennis match that's going on related to The Hobbit. So the Hobbit trap, remember, here are some pitfalls to the evolving mummy science, and the Hobbit trap sort of elucidates this quite nicely. Fame, money, notoriety, idiosyncrasies of universities and researchers themselves. So those are the kinds of things that we deal with out there in the world of mummy science research. It seems everybody wants to be an Indiana Jones. So I'm recommending these future directions for mummy science studies. First of all, organization. I think a new professional organization should be established for mummy science studies. The organization should represent all subspecialties, and they should provide a venue for idea, research, and resource sharing so that we don't reinvent the wheel, so that mummy science can move forward collegially. I think there should be evidence-based science studies. Recently, in 2008, this evidence-based science studies following the medical model was proposed by Frank Rulli and Heather Gill Robinson at the Paleopathology Association meeting, and it intends to suggest standards of practice for the subspecialties, and it's physician-driven. And I agree, all practice must have measurable outcomes, but we must also weigh the benefit-risk ratio of each applied modality. I think that mummy science needs to establish practice standards or guidelines, established through consensus with varied subspecialties. Using existing professional organizations, include description and definition of the method, including the objectives for its application, procedures and technique for method application, statement of possible outcomes, state the limitations, assessment of objective attainment, and personnel and training. So that would be the outline of a standard. And then these would be updated on a scheduled basis as new technologies came into play regarding mummy sciences. I think there should be an evaluation of procedures as part of the practice standards guidelines. When a new procedure is to be used, there should be an evaluation protocol. In other words, and evaluation protocol for existing procedures to include risk-benefit analysis, cost, availability, applicability, and outcome value. What's the data collected? And therefore, does it really contribute at this point? Not that scientific research can't be continued, but before it becomes part of standard practice and a part of mummy science studies, a subspecialty within mummy science studies, it should be evaluated. Evaluation and application of new technologies. Mummy science tends to mirror medical advances in technology, and as before, a frank evaluation system of value added versus the wow factor should be assessed. What did we learn from a 3D image of King Tut's face? What did we learn about the life and times of that individual, for example? Or is it all wow factor? A debate should exist about collegial versus corporate control of mummy science study.